Hello. Good evening, everyone. How are we? Oh, one second. Can you turn the mic down? Carl, can you grab a mask, please, for me? Oh, sure. All right. Good evening, and welcome to Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Micah, and I'll be your host tonight. We're excited to host tonight's event with George Prochnik, presenting his new book, I Dream with Open Eyes. We'll be talking with James Lasdun, so you're in for an excellent evening. Before I turn things over to them, just a few housekeeping things. Please turn off or silence cell phones. I love this scramble. I love the scramble. Masks are to be worn the whole evening. Signed books are for sale at the register, and if you pre-ordered one with Eventbrite, they're at the register as well. And George will be personalizing after the event. Our interviewer for this evening is James Lasdun. Lasdun has written several books of fiction, memoir, and poetry. His essays have appeared in the New Yorker, Harper's, Toronto, and the London Review of Books. His work has been nominated for the T.S. Eliot Poetry Prize, the Rathbones Folio Prize, and the L.A. Times Book Award, and long-listed for the Booker Mann Prize. His story, The Siege, was adapted by Bernardo Bertolucci for his film, The Siege. His last book was the novel, Afternoon of a Faun. We'll be speaking with our featured author, George Prochnik. Prochnik was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in General Nonfiction in 2021. He is the author of 5 books of nonfiction, including Stranger in a Strange Land, which was a New York Times Editor's Choice, and was shortlisted for the 2018 Wingate Literary Prize in the United Kingdom. He has written for the New Yorker, the New York Times, Book Forum, and Los Angeles Review of Books, and is editor of a large, at-large for Cabinet Magazine. Born in Junction, Colorado, Prochnik currently lives in London with his wife and their son. George's new book, I Dream with Open Eyes, begins with an exploration of Prochnik's ancestral past, the pilgrimage of his mother's family, who were among the first English settlers in the New World. In the aftermath of the 2016 election, a parallel migration unfolds as Prochnik, along with his wife and their son, makes the decision to uproot their lives in New York to move to England. So you're in for something special tonight. George will be reading from his book, then James will join him in conversation, and you'll have the chance to ask your questions after that. So please join me in welcoming to the stage, George and James. No, not great. Let's keep adjusting a little bit, and then I'll adjust the mic.
Oh, I thought they were adjusting. Should I get one? Sorry.
Wait, did you say, did I use standard? No,
Should we just go for the handheld mic? This is is that all right? Can people hear me? How's this? Is that more? Yes. Anyway, there are many thanks in order. Is this okay then? There are many thanks in order, but I want to thank James in particular for having been an early supporter of this book and for interviewing me now, and also my family, who to some extent this book is all about. I'm going to read a section near the end of the book. It is a book about leaving here, this particular neighborhood, and I'm going to read a small section that revolves around the moment when we had more or less made the decision to leave, and we're trying incoherently to explain our thinking to our son. His name is Raphael. So often, the words I found to actually say to my son took the form of admonitions that sounded, even in my own ears, at once pallid and frantic. We must not allow ourselves to be contained by our technologies. We must refuse to be summarized or shepherded by algorithms, to advance someone else's commercial or political strategy. Until I am dead, no one can ever be guaranteed to truly know me, declared the revolutionary director Pasolini. For as long as we are alive, we lack meaning, and the language of our life is untranslatable, a chaos of possibilities, an uninterrupted search for relations and meanings. It was this same spirit that inspired Pasolini to stridently identify with every type of, quote, banned humanity, unquote, with blacks, Jews, gypsies, and the ragazzi of the streets against the claustrophobic consumer society he saw engulfing reality. You see, Raphael, the infinitude of the individual must be cherished, or the collective will, your own nature, the full, and then I heard the words leave my lips and watched them shatter on the shoals of the virtual. Felt him thinking, but this is the world you've placed me in. What choice do I have but to make some kind of peace with its terms, pre-programmed or otherwise? I'd sat beside him recently while he played Spider-Man on a PlayStation at a friend's house, watching him fly from skyscraper to skyscraper on silken cords spun from his palms above the grid of a meticulously reconstituted Gotham. Every facade, every block, every neighborhood evoked sights imprinted on my memory from countless hours spent plodding back and forth between them. Now he streaked and twirled like a 21st century Ariel above the furiously jammed traffic and self-enclosed trudging pedestrians, scaling buildings in seconds, leaping across wide avenues. All his feats achieved with a few rapid-fire marionette flicks of his fingers, while carnage, smoke, and horror reigned on the streets. It all made sense. It was all true. This was the city today. Only the Spider-Men we looked up to were plutocrats who, instead of fighting crime, were the perpetrators. Their gravity-free carte blanche, the politically depleting fantasy of millions of exhausted workers who commuted daily over the tangled, prostrate bodies of those already defeated at some primary level of competition. The longer I watched him play, the more I realized I was looking into a mirror of my own New York history. Hadn't I struggled along every one of these glaring, blasted streets, dodging killer trucks and blithe sociopaths, supporting wasted, hurt, and sick friends, trapped in crowds trying to escape the dark tunnel, staggering under my own bags and illnesses, creeping over broken glass between the murderers and martyrs? I remembered that shattered storefront, the shiny big box outlet, mobbed by faceless shoppers, turning round and round in inexplicable circles. Those hard-jawed, black-suited businessmen with the big shiny watches, I'd stepped into elevators with them, allowed myself to be backed into corners while they folded beefy hands and locked briefcases over manically ironed crotches. That shriveled, cardboard boxed couple with knees up and backs against a wall, staring vacantly at passers-by while stroking their sad hound, I pushed my loose bills into that very big gulp cup. Those smoldering trash cans. That strutting sunglassed supermodel, tossing her glittery locks back while a photographer contorted all sides of her as though he were being electrocuted. The rat with the long, filthy tail making a dash for the sewer grate. I knew it. The endless, blinking, pounding limousine with limber girls and boys waving their fists out the sunroof and shrieking. The gold chains in the windows. The gold chains twinkling on the pumped chests of the gym droids. The gold chains strangling the ostrich necks of trustees teetering out of gold taxes for the last age of Midas Gala. The fire bursting in glissando sequence along row after row of converted warehouse window panes. I knew every stone in the game. I opened my palms to the cracks of sky between the scrapers, waiting to see plumes of silk spuming up from my flesh, high into the dark air, latching onto silhouetted water towers, releasing me at last, from the cruel New York asphalt. But the lines on my hands merely multiplied and crisscrossed, wrapping my own body in time. How many of these stones were stained with the blood of those I loved, or whom I should never have allowed to remain strangers? How could my son not want to spend his hours sailing in a terpsichorean sublime, high above these endless, high-res incarnations of all the blurry urban realities I pulled myself through my whole adult life, like a trampled snake, who'd swallowed half the detritus of the 20th century, and now, stuffed and lost, was trying to slither off to some prelapsarian garden boasting lots of fresh fruit trees. He was Beanie, the white crescent controller, waxing and sliding from view between his shifting hands like moon phases in fast motion. Why would anyone ever want to leave this New York, not New York, the doppelganger Big Apple of all access and no insides? Caught in our endless interior showdowns, we'd ceded the real outdoors to the archons of a fantasy nightmare. Now the whole city lay snarled in the web of its own squandered superpowers.
Oh, that was a wonderful reading, George, from an extraordinary book, and a very original book, and like all really original books. Am I audible? Okay, thanks. It defies conventional description, but I want to try, in the short time we have, to give a sort of overview of what you've done here. At the most basic level, it does tell the story of your family's decision to leave, not just for another neighborhood, but for another continent. And what drove you to that, and how you inhabited that dilemma. But it's many other things as well. I mean, it's partly a memoir, a sort of family memoir about the two sides of your family, two very different sides, both of whom found a refuge in America at one time or other along the family tree, and how those sort of converge in you. Your mother's family arrived on the Mayflower, right? And your father himself was narrowly escaped the Holocaust, was Viennese Jews. So for both of those sides, this country represented a kind of shining city. You look at that. You talk about. We don't want to talk about that. Then it's partly an analysis through the lens of history of this dire moment that we all get now. And then finally, it becomes this sort of visionary book about, well, how can we use literature and art and our own spirit to transcend like this? So we should be able to fill 25 minutes talking about that. Would you like to start talking about these two sort of rivers of influence that converge in you through your family?
Sure. Is this too loud now? It is, yes. Should I speak without a mic, or are you going to turn this down?
We're going to turn it down.
Okay. Well, I do have a pretty extreme clash of cultures represented in my parents' families. My father's family, as you said, escaped Vienna in 1938, really by the skin of their teeth. They, in fact, only made it out because my grandfather was a doctor who had treated a man who became a reasonably high-ranking Nazi officer. Even though he was no longer my grandfather's patient, this man showed up at his door and said, "You're going to be picked up tomorrow." So they went into hiding overnight, hid in Vienna for a while, got on a train to Zurich, went from Zurich finally to Genoa, and after many, many mishaps, made it to these shores. And for my father, the sanctuary that America offered inspired incredible patriotism and undying patriotism, even when he could critique different aspects of the society, and even as he got older and began to be visited by young Viennese who were doing, in lieu of their army service, some kind of Holocaust survivor communication work. And he liked them very much and felt that their education was so superior to anything offered here. He had an undying belief in American exceptionalism. And my mother's family, as James said, had a much longer lineage of both flight and refuge. Not only did her family come over on the Mayflower, one side of her family, but at least the story goes that one of those ancestors was the first person to touch the New World, and it was a girl named Mary Chilton. And I start the story of the book with this moment when, after this very, very difficult voyage, I try to imagine what it was for this girl in the event that it was her, or in the event that we have to imagine that it was, springing off this boat into an entirely new continent, into a new set of possibilities. And it frames really what I do with the book in the sense that I'm trying to reclaim the space of the unknown, which is generally, I think, threatening in a theological sense, and threatening to us right now. There seem so many dark possibilities. But maybe we can try and think about what we can do to impregnate the unknown before us, also with notions of a space of great hope and possibility. There's a quote that I come back to, that I've thought about for years, by Gershom Scholem, who was the first person to take the field of Kabbalah and turn it into an academic discipline. And he talked about moments that were history's plastic hours, moments when nothing was fixed, everything felt in motion, and when if you move, something happens. And often the something that happens is very, very bad. But it's also a moment when, even as individuals, our gestures and our efforts to announce our vision of what can and what should be can have, I think, untold kinds of knock-on effects. And I'm trying in this book to at least present a series of different lenses on where we are now, partly historical through this family history, and partly, as James said, by taking lenses from other disciplines and jamming them into the space of the political as much as I can.
There's something I wanted to quote in connection with that, where you say, where you talk more personally about this, I mean, how this connection to history feels sort of within you. I mean, it's one thing to have these very interesting, culturally, historically interesting ancestors, but okay, so how does that manifest inside yourself as you're kind of pondering, you know, these large questions that you face? And you say at one point, my connection to American history reverts to me as a debt, not a property deed. Would you elaborate on that?
I thought about that idea a lot living in this neighborhood where, in fact, what's now Fort Greene Park, the fort that was there, had been, I think in its original iteration, it was made by someone named Rufus Putnam, who was in some way related to my family. One side of my grandmother's family were Putnams, the other side were Cabots. And I felt increasingly, the longer I lived here and seeing the neighborhood transform in the ways that I did, why in the world should the fact that I had that historical provenance give me more right to be here? Why, in fact, shouldn't it give me less right in the sense that I had my time in this space and it was incumbent upon me, really, because I had such deep temporal connections to what Fort Greene was, to withdraw and make space for others. And that was another part of this very complex and very vexed decision to leave, was the question of why anyone thinks birthplace is legitimizing to their position as a citizen against somebody who comes under completely different circumstances, someone fortunate enough to own property, etc. It troubled me. And so I was made very conscious of the history that I, in some way, embody genetically and through stories by both my parents in very, very different ways. And it doesn't feel like it liberates me for anything. It's a burden, particularly at moments when the country is in crisis, to understand what it's asking of me. And I thought about this strange symmetry between the date that my mother's ancestors arrived on was 1620, and I don't want to get too Kabbalistic, but 2016, 1620. There are these strange. I do think that there are strange symmetries to the flight that these Puritans were making in their zealotry from a repressive society, but seeking some kind of new possibility, new sense of what a country could be, and something of the crazy move that I made.
So the Puritan ancestors are fleeing the repressive Elizabethan Jacobean England. On your father's side, the family's fleeing the Nazis, and you begin to. But now here we are with a country that is no longer this place of, or no longer quite the same kind of place of refuge that it once was. No longer the idealistic future and the great hope of all mankind, etc., etc. And you find yourself, you're here, and Trump and Trumpism are on the rise, and you as many people were, you were very, very alarmed by this, and you look to history for parallels. And what you find yourself looking at most of all is Thomas Mann writing about the rise of the Nazis in Germany, Stefan Zweig, wondering, whether to stay, whether to go, etc., etc. Would you discuss that?
Yeah, I mean, in some way I was completely the wrong person to have to think about these things, because I had been thinking about them for a long time, so I couldn't help. I'd written about a number of Central European Jews and about the dilemmas they faced, and knew that in the case of my own grandfather, what I didn't mention about why they were there so late is because he couldn't believe it was going to happen to him. He had been a soldier in the First World War and with the Habsburg Empire, and had been taken prisoner of war very early on, taken to Siberia, and had helped stem an outbreak of severe illness in the prison camp, and was decorated thereafter, and just felt it can't come from me. So those questions about how to read this moment, and even knowing all the ways that it is not like Nazi Germany, and that there's so many falsehoods, there's so many traps in the analogy. And I say at one point that, it's like we hear history echoing, but it's in this sort of almost through a funhouse mirror, where I thought of the crepuscular electronic soundtrack and the birds at the end with those strange squawks. We know they're there, but we don't know what to do with the knowledge. I'll say one thing about Trump. If I can find the page. Well, yeah, this is just a paragraph. I talk about how my wife Rebecca and myself felt very embarrassed to admit that Trump was a big part of what drove us to make this decision, because people would say to us, you're not going to let this clown, this garbage man, dictate your behavior. And I came to feel that, on the one hand, one couldn't possibly overstate his boorish, vacuous absurdity. On the other hand, one couldn't overstate his world historical significance. These and these are the words of the living God. It was as though humanity at large had become hypnotized by the idea of its own fascination with someone they knew to be a bottomless void. The man might have been just a bad joke, but he was an infinitely bad joke nonetheless. And at the beginning of the book, I'm actually in Berlin, and I'd gone there to see an exhibition about Weimar-era Germany. And it was a very good exhibition that went into all the different manifestations of both leftist and reactionary politics that were festering, germinating in that time. And I followed around a young teacher who was leading a group of students. And the longer I was with them, and the longer I looked at this material, the more I felt it. What I was hearing was, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. And I felt somewhat shocked by how there is this injunction to learn from history. But what do we do with those lessons that actually we can apply in a way that makes sense to what are clearly never the same circumstances? And this show seemed to conclude with the idea politicians should compromise, which of course is true and admirable, but it doesn't take us too far with our problems. And I came to feel that with respect to fascism in particular, that we might need to abandon the quibbles about it is, it isn't, it could be, it might be, it's becoming, it's not becoming, and instead sort of invert Chamberlain's statement as he steps down from the airplane and say, this is fascism for our times. This is what it looks like. Something else that I thought about a lot, and I've thought about since writing the book, is I think we've been put in this state of perpetual suspension. We feel, well, the next election, this is the big one. The next set of events, this is really going to determine what happens. Everything feels pivotal. But I worry that this sense of an impending anything is partly a factor of the way that we receive our news now in this faucet form, where the stream always has to come. There isn't really necessarily a defining event when you have water coming out of a faucet. It keeps coming. And I think we may be in whatever it is that we're waiting for. It is this moment. And so whatever responses we make, collectively or individually, they're incumbent upon us now. And that's another aspect of what I was trying to do with this book. We all know that real change only comes about through collective action, and in no way do I dispute that. But at the same time, most of us spend a great deal of time alone, either in our heads or literally. And what do we do? What do we do with that time? What do we do with that urge to, in some way, individually countermand what we see happening before us, to protest and to, if not bring about change in a global way, force ourselves to enact our despondency in some manner other than just by cringing into ourselves.
Well, I mean, one of the things you point out is that in a very dark way, figures like Trump prove the power of the individual to make a difference to the world.
Right, he's a negative example of what I was thinking about. And saying that maybe, it isn't so much about imposing our righteous will on the world, not pretending that, but finding some way of individually trying to go beyond the equation in which we seem trapped.
And just so nobody gets the idea that you're in any way simplistic about this, I mean, one of the many great things about the book is how, the way you sort of will enter the mindset of, for instance, Trump supporters in a very open, curious way, and also the way that you don't exempt yourself from the problem, and there's a very funny section of the book where you start talking about the work you do for a living, and you say, how did I earn my money? Filthily. So perhaps you'd like to, we don't have to dwell on it.
Right, well, one thing that came to bother me was this notion that the people say in this neighborhood, in this city, we're living in a bubble, and that's why we didn't know what was going on. I began to really take umbrage at that idea, because every time you step on a subway, you're in much less of a bubble than many people in more homogeneous parts of, homogeneous communities who are just staring at Fox News all the time. I don't think that the issue is so much that we were absolutely blind. Many of us read articles. There was some reporting on this rising movement of something different and new and insurgent. But the problem seems to me a problem with capitalism and what's available even to those of us who might have the most idealistic sense of what society should become. To live in New York City is difficult. I don't need to tell anyone here that. And to make enough money to live in some immaculate way is almost impossible. I worked for many years for a publicist. I managed to write many books in the office, surreptitiously, so I tried to do what I could. Nonetheless, I was there. And I came to feel that, well, there was a moment in the office that I'll quote. The day after Trump was elected, the boss, who was a mainstream Democrat, called everyone together and sort of commiserated exactly and said, all right, we're going to keep doing our work. And most of the publicity work was for decent organizations. I'll say a word about that as well. But he said, we just have to keep going, and this too will pass. And everyone sort of had a moment of sadness. And then I just heard these different jokes, these different snickers start happening. Like, I can't wait to see Melania on Saturday Night Live, and I can't wait to see this. And it very quickly turned into a source of snark. And even beyond snark, there were many, many people in finance who say, not to pick on finance, but in finance, who woke up the morning after the election, after I'm sure having voted for Hillary, and said, well, that's too bad. Boys, let's make some money. And I'm not, I can't begin to criticize the person who is a fervent, messianic believer in Trump, because to me, that is a disease and a delusion. But I think I worry about our own complicity. And I felt with myself that the real issue was that I was more or less inside that golden bubble with Trump and his people. I mean, the company that I worked for didn't ever actually represent Trump, but that was pure chance. They represented other big real estate developers. I wasn't very far removed. And so what that I voted correctly? In what way did that exonerate me or make me better than them? I mean, clearly not better enough in any case. So yeah, there's a play that I loved by Wally Shawn called The Designated Mourner. I don't know how many of you know it, but one of the reasons that I think it's a really important political work is because he's critiquing the readers and the people who care about the intellect and the refined life, and saying, how could you have let so many people down at a moment of crisis? And I feel some of that myself. And every time I look at, well,
yeah, well, as the intellectuals can only ever answer, it's our job. It's our job to betray and be too feeble to do anything. I want to move towards the sort of more visionary dimensions of the book. I mean, that's a very shorthand way of talking about it, but I want to get there through. I mean, you use history as a way of analysing the present, but you also make a lot of use of Freud, particularly the Freud of civilization and discontents. And you contrast Freud, or you yoke Freud together with another family ancestor, Putnam, who, what's his first name?
James Jackson.
Yes. Who was a luminary of the early sort of American psychology, psychiatry. I don't know which word they would have used, but he became very smitten with Freud and met Freud. And they had an interesting relationship. He had great respect for Freud, before many members of his profession did. But he also wanted to kind of slightly correct Freud's, he tried to get Freud to sort of slightly embrace another dimension other than the rather dark vision of humanity that he was by then espousing in Civilization and its Discontents. And you yourself have felt this kind of dichotomy in yourself between the dark tide, you put it, of Freudian thinking and Putnam's more idealistic view of what psychology, psychoanalysis could do. Could you talk about, there's a wonderful scene in the book where you actually wander around Freud's house with another family member, your sister.
With my sister who's here, yes. Well, I'll say just first a word about Civilization and its Discontents, why I focus on that text. In a way, I think it's the text for our times, because it really is posing the question, is civilization possible? Or is there such a problem with making enough people feel that they belong to whatever civilization is constructed, that there is always going to be an overwhelming destructive force. It's a book, I have, I think, a slightly different take on it than the typical one. Freud begins in a very surprising way. He describes a correspondence that he has, a friendship that he has with Romain Rolland, who's a very, very prestigious man, French man of letters, who speaks of himself as not being religious, but having this susceptibility to an oceanic feeling, a feeling of oneness with all humanity, that is for him really the redemptive vision of humanity to which all the creative work and the humanitarian work that he engaged in was aspiring towards. And Freud, at the beginning of this book, which if you read it in light of this, he picks this story up and then he just drops it very abruptly. He sort of says, this guy, Roland, is the greatest. You rarely have a person who's actually really talented and they're a super celebrity. Fantastic. He says, I have no idea what he's talking about with this oceanic feeling. I never had it. And I think it has something to do, in the end, although Freud doesn't say this explicitly, with his own experiences of anti-Semitism, being a Jew, that he's been excluded from the capacity for these feelings, even though Freud analyzes them in relationship to the mother, and breastfeeding, and all the rest of it. The question is, where did it go in Freud's case? And I think it goes into a society that could have had different policies and could have had different forms of education that might have enabled him, like Roland, who was from a good French middle-class bourgeois family, to experience the oneness with the cosmos. But my great-grandfather's relationship with with Freud, has always intrigued me, and I wrote my first book, in fact, about it. But it seemed important to revisit certain aspects of it here, because Putnam had been part of a group of Boston neurologists and psychologists who were, as James said, prestigious. William James was part of the group. There were others, and they were verging on something like talk therapy, but they were hostile to Freud, and they were hostile to Freud particularly because of his sexuality, and perhaps a little bit also because he was Jewish. And when Freud came on his one trip to America in 1909, he gave a series of lectures at Clark University. And my great-grandfather, who'd written some pretty disparaging things about Freud prior to this, heard Freud speak, and he was just, even though he was already in his 60s, was just, that's it, this is synthesizing all these observations that we had made in the course of our clinical work. They had, doctors at that time, of course they heard sexual problems. I mean, it was maybe couched in different sorts of language, but they knew what it was. And for Putnam, hearing Freud's ability to kind of create a master narrative of how these things fit into childhood history, etc., was revelatory. And he invited him to his Adirondack camp, Putnam Camp, that he co-founded with William James. And the two of them then became friends and had correspondence for the remainder of Putnam's life. He died in 1918. And immediately, Putnam began introducing psychoanalytic work into his therapy. He went 100%, but as James said, he wanted Freud to acknowledge that there was a problem if you just expose people's neuroses. Putnam said, you don't give them any way to build up a new self after they discover what's wrong with them. He kept using this analogy. He said it would have been like if Virgil had abandoned Dante on the slopes of purgatory. There was no next step. And he said, it's not that you have, Putnam said, it's not that you have to give them a particular heaven, of course not. But shouldn't we be allowing people to create an ideal vision of their best selves and giving them something to work towards after they had learned all the ways that they were screwed up? And this debate continued throughout their correspondence. And Freud kept saying, no, it's not going to work, we can't do it. Most people are, Freud was certainly elitist and felt most people weren't capable of that kind of work. And moreover, who are we to be telling someone, oh, you need to be going for your highest moral self? He said people will get there if they're meant to. And Putnam kept saying, they're not necessarily going to get there, and maybe we need to open paths towards them. And as much as Freud is the more profound thinker and the more extraordinary writer, I remain attached to Putnam's idea. That maybe there is a way that analysis can do more than deconstruct the self and sort of show you the pieces. Maybe there are lights that we can either illuminate through culture or through a political education that are incumbent upon us to give everyone an opportunity to realize their best selves. I mean, this was something, Putnam felt very strongly that everyone has this grotesque mix, grotesque only in the sense of being so bizarre, of basically good impulses and terrible impulses, and you never surmount any aspect of that mix, but you can maybe shine the light more on sides of yourself that have the capacity to contribute to society in a meaningful way.
Well, I hope we have time to, we're going to have some time for questions, but I want to sort of bring our part of the conversation to an end by, I mean, you very much coming out of the side of you that has this kind of attachment to Putnam, is your own project to write a book that is itself a kind of point of light, to use the phrase that Auden has in the great 1939 poem. One wants to, the best thing one can be is to be, a small point of light in this encroaching darkness. And you talk about the problems of being that, of embodying that, of creating a work that can do that. And partly you approach it by using works of art, a couple of Titian paintings principally, but other things too, as sort of instruments to help you towards articulating that kind of project. And you also have this extended imaginary conversation with your youngest son, Raphael, which you read partly from. And you talk about what you call you say, our Enlightenment project needs a romantic vehicle. This thing that I think a lot of people who would sympathize with you are feeling, well, the Democrats, the left, progressive wing, whatever, doesn't ever seem to be able to compete with the other side in terms of a kind of mythic appeal to the imagination of its followers. And I think there was an op-ed even in the Times today about something exactly like that. And so in the pursuit of that, you've written a very vulnerable kind of book, because it has to be, you have to sort of open yourself to the possibility of a cynical response. But what I like about what you've done, and I'm sorry I'm a bit confused here, but it's rather hard to talk about, but I'd like to hear you try. The best thing would be just to read what he's written. But how you approach writing a book that actually is something more than just a kind of terse, cool, temperature commentary and analysis.
Thanks for that question, which has some of the answers within it. Even though I didn't know that James was going to ask this, I had in fact written a little note that I think speaks to at least part of the question. I say early on in the book that I came to realize after we had made the move that I didn't really know what we'd done. And so I invert the famous line from Marx about hitherto philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. And I came to feel, well, we changed the world, and now the point is to try to interpret it, to try to understand it. And one thing that's clear, we didn't ever believe we were escaping anything. It was a gesture, intrinsically theatrical to an extent, and not intended to be paradigmatic, not intended to be, get out everyone while you can. In that sense, it was always in some way aesthetic, in the sense of being on many levels almost anti-utilitarian, almost self-defeating in its core. There's that famous line from the art critic Erwin Panofsky, where he speaks about the idea of the importance of useless knowledge. And I write at one point meaning both in the metaphorical sense and in the literal sense, that we'd made a spectacle of ourselves in the way that we left. And so if it wasn't an effort in any genuine way to get away, England, I heard a great line by today. Someone said, not my line, they said, speaking of after Johnson's departure, they said, well, now the ringmaster has left the circus and the lions are eating the clowns. That's pretty good. But in any case, not having escaped, there was a sense of a kind of enacted repudiation or reorientation, a somewhat histrionic scream of no. And it's why I found myself thinking, even now, slightly more than 4 years after we left, that we were quite successful at blowing up our life in Brooklyn, but maybe somewhat less brilliant at setting up a new life in London. At least in my case. It's different for Rebecca since she's from England. And some of these issues resonate very in another way for her. But I know that I'm still in free fall, and I'm not sure that that's the worst place to be at this particular moment in history when so many people are in a forced situation of free fall and displacement and disorientation. There's a strange sense, maybe even of being at home with, homelessness is not the right word, at home with being in motion and not finding a place to rest. And so I think that the vulnerability that I had to put on display in this book was owning up to the incredibly problematic nature of what we've done. I mean, needless to say, I miss people here tremendously. Loved ones, friends and family, and nothing repairs that hole. But I still have not found myself thinking that the life we were leading could have continued or anything like it. And partly maybe, again, because of having come out of the particular lines of historical and philosophical thought that I did. And this book, in some way, it's as though, as the people here who are writers or painters or musicians, dancers, or work in some form of the arts, you want to believe, after having spent a lifetime in the arts, that you can create almost some kind of party-colored symphonic fusillade that you're going to shoot at those walls of Mordor, these new dark political realities, and somehow they're going to come tumbling down. But all that art and literature, maybe it just can manage to at least make a dent in the terrible grayness that threatens us now. And yeah, so this book was, I had to put myself into the cannon and shoot myself as well.
Well, I think that's a fantastic answer. And I think we're open to the floor.
Thanks so much, James.
I'm sure there's people wondering how it's going. You sort of began to answer that. But
Right.
I'm particularly interested as someone who's made the journey in the opposite direction. Wouldn't go back to London and wild horses.
Yeah, well, you don't go for political ideas. I mean, England was where we could go in the end. I mean, I quote an Elizabeth Bishop poem about that idea that even our choices in travel that may seem free, there's a lot of determining factors. I mean, we, of course, we're privileged, we're lucky, we could have chosen other places, but that was where having a child, etc., that was what was possible, and that was where there was some family to go to. Rebecca's mother is still living and alone, and it was important for her to spend time with her. There were things that converged on that point in space, but it's, England also has a madness that sometimes I think Americans aren't fully aware of, maybe at least until this moment. You think of that staid tea-drinking country, but it's really not that, as James knows. I always think of the story with Stefan Zweig, where he lived in England as a refugee for a period of time. But long before that, he purchased a Blake drawing of Shakespeare's King John. And he writes in his memoir how this this drawing, I carried it around with me everywhere because I loved it so much. It seemed to me to just embody what England was. And I didn't know the drawing. And if you look it up, it's like something in a Hitchcock movie, in Strangers on a Train. It's this psychotic king. His eyes are absolutely wild, with spiky hair going off all directions. And so, I do feel like I have a bad record in terms of moving countries at this point. I mean, I moved to Jerusalem, and the First Intifada started, and I came back to New York, lived right next to the trade towers. The trade towers fell. I went to England, and it's falling apart. So I'm going to spare myself. Spare other countries myself.
George, you've written about emigres, refugees, in at least 3 books. You just mentioned Zweig, but there's also Louis Sholem you mentioned as well, but Heine most recently. And I wondered how that work either helped you think about your own trajectory or hindered you or whatever.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it helped me. And one argument that I make with works of art and with these stories of different figures, the name of the book, by the way, I Dream with Open Eyes, actually comes from Heine. And I argue that what I believe he's talking about, and what maybe is something we can aspire to, is that idea of dreaming of a better moment, of a vision, of a utopia, of the best moment, but with open eyes, never denying the harsh immediate realities we confront. But in the case of all those thinkers and writers, and in the case of the different painters I use, I'm trying to show how a great work of art or a great work of literature, they project backwards in time and forward in time, and we project ourselves into them, and we are projected out of them. And these experiences of exile, which are inevitably ones that create an acute consciousness of what it might be like to have a home, and the difficulty or impossibility of realizing it in any secure way. I think I find something ultimately solacing in the recognition of how often this terrible experience yet produces these extraordinary flowers from the mud of despair and suffering, of acuteness, lucidity, contrary views, of a refusal to accept the status quo as a necessity, because there is no real. What does the status quo for someone who has been forcibly exiled in a way that I wasn't? And self-exiling almost became inevitable after having written about exile so often.
There's a book that I was back in again recently by Raymond Geuss, the idea of critical theory. And the basic project of it is to line up Marx and Habermas and Adorno and Freud and say one of the things that these thinkers have in common is a confidence that if you uncover the real state of affairs in a society or a psyche and communicate it properly, then that in itself will be emancipatory. And I take it that's something of the sort of Freud line that you're talking about. The idea that this kind of psychological archaeology, properly conducted, will come to good. And I'm just curious how, given that you sort of put yourself more in Putnam's position, how you fill in that side of the argument for yourself, psychologically or politically. What kinds of examples, what kinds of ideals can we pose ourselves, and how?
Well, I mean, I first would say I think I oscillate between the two positions, because on my father's side there were analysts and Viennese analysts and psychologists, and so I bounce back and forth between them. And there's a line from Emerson that I ultimately use, that we can only obey our own polarities. And I try to argue against taking a fixed position. But what James was referring to, I think, talking about visionary, or whether that's exactly the correct word or not, I go through a list of different political gestures and say, contemporary gestures, something you could say, the NFL players taking the knee, older, the Buddhist monks lighting themselves on fire, in ACT UP, the placing of a condom over Jesse Helms' house. These moments when theater, Extinction Rebellion has been hit or miss, but they have done some of this quite beautifully and powerfully. And I talk about how these individual gestures have pointed towards, they have created a new lens on what's happening. They have done something more than just uncovering the archaeology. They have made explicit and aesthetic and painfully visible the contradictions in which we currently live. And I think that there's a lot to learn from it. And part of the book, because it's interpreting what happened, I try to slow way down certain moments, as one does, revisiting a trauma. And there's a whole chapter that's the night of the election. And I'm really showing it frame by frame, literally in a sense, by looking back at the ABC full footage of that night. And there are just so many absolutely extraordinary moments in that ceremony. I call Trump's presidency the first really Lacanian presidency because nothing is hidden. And it's as though it's the emperor's new clothes. What do you do when the emperor revels in his nakedness and the audience and the watchers applaud that nudity? I'll give you one example of something that it still boggles my mind. When Trump enters the stage in the moment of accepting the victory, there's a song playing, and I Shazammed the song. And the song is from the Wolfgang Petersen film, Air Force One. And if any of you know what that's about, it's about a kind of, the American president, played by Harrison Ford, goes and meets the head of Russia. And they sort of agree to have this new great relationship. And then he gets on a plane that's hijacked by terrorists posing as journalists. And Harrison Ford proceeds to kill all the fake journalists. And that's literally the song as Trump takes the stage. That and earlier on, they're playing the Stones, You Can't Always Get What You Want, which Mitch Jagger said he was sort of surprised by since it's a doomy ballad about drugs in Chelsea. But if you listen to the song, it's also very telling. So many aspects of what Trump did were unbelievably thoughtfully executed, even if the thought was coming out of an unconscious dream state. And I speak near the end about this extraordinary, somewhat mysterious figure, an early black surrealist named Pierre Yoyot. He died already, I believe he was dead in combat in 1933. But he kept going after, this was when surrealism was getting very close to the communist movement, but there was a bit of a dance going on. And he felt that you couldn't only look at what was happening in terms of labor and production and ownership. He talked about this idea of the misery of desire. And that phrase really haunted me, thinking about this moment we've gone through, and that you have to somehow address that misery as well. And there was a way in which the theatrics of what Trump did that. And I think the left has to really look at what a counter-theatrics would consist of. And there are glimmers of it. There have been glimmers in the last couple of years, but I think there's a lot further we can go, and that's really the direction that's added onto, complementary to the archaeology work.
I think we are at the end. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.